Chief Takyi, so many ways of pronouncing his name now, we're learning the new ways, the lecture. This annual lecture is a way of marking the significant contribution that Takyi made to the emancipation struggle in Jamaica. It is time for him to be made a national hero. I'm one of the advocates for this. And lectures such as these bring to mind, for young people especially, the significance of the work that Chief Takyi did. So I think it's so important to acknowledge the Center for Reparation Research, also the St. Mary Foundation for Takyi, and the Department of History and Archaeology at the UWI for hosting this lecture. It really is an important event. And I'm also going to welcome our guest speaker, Professor Vincent Brown, because he's a man of the hour, but he's going to be properly acknowledged later on in the program. So for now, I want to invite on the Honorable Norman Dunn, the MP for Southeast St. Mary, to make his opening remarks. Welcome, Norman.
Thank you very, very much. I must apologize. I might not be able to stay for the entire lecture series. The lecture series, Madam Moderator.
We understand, sir.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. So I was saying earlier that I must apologize for possibly not being able to stay for the entire lecture series because I'm currently at Parliament participating in a committee meeting on custom. And so I just want to place that on record. I would like also to recognize, of course, the Center for Reparation Research. And I'd like to acknowledge, of course, our Professor Carolyn Cooper, our keynote speaker, Professor Vincent Brown, Professor Shepard, who I enjoy listening on radio, my colleague, Member of Parliament, Dr. Guy, Head of the Department of History and Archaeology, Professor Enrique Okenva, our special guest, and of course, my very own St. Mary man, Derek Robinson. So this, I agree with you, Professor Cooper, that it's about time that Takyi be made a national hero. So I'm pleased to join you here today in commemorating Chief Takyi's legacy. And I'd like to commend the Center for Reparation and Research, the St. Mary Takyi Foundation, and the Department of History and Archaeology at Mona Institute, Mona campus of University of West Indies, for hosting this lecture. Now, there's a quote that if you don't know where you're come from, you don't know where you're going, and that's Maya Angelou. So therefore, it is crucial that our people understand the impact of our rich history and what our ancestors fought for and sacrificed themselves for. Through this sacrifice, the position of our people was elevated, and today we are entrepreneurs, leaders, and partake in basic human freedom that were denied of them. So the spirit of Chief Takyi is a testimony to the society that embraced slavery and rejecting normal human and heroic struggles of our ancestors in the long campaign for emancipation. The chiefs resolved to ensure that he fought for his people's freedom is echoed throughout our rich history in the body of great men and women who refused to accept the bond of slavery that has been placed on African people for much of our history. So, Professor, as a descendant of these African kings and queens, we have come from royal bloodline that thrived in Africa Unlike what persons want us to believe, Africa history is usurped by the advent of slavery. The fighting spirit of Chief Takyi is ever present in the Jamaican people and can be seen in our resilience and resolve to strive and excel in the face of extreme adversity, which has been evident throughout the pandemic, COVID pandemic. The spirit of our ancestors is rise and strong within our people. This is evident in our economy as we continue to thrive and strive even in the most adverse situation. So we continue to display the resilience, tenacity, and fighting spirit of Chief Takyi's legacy. And it's evident in how we have evolved from the era of slavery until now. Many of our freedoms we take for granted today were fought by our ancestors, and we need to honor their sacrifice as we move forward as a society. I therefore applaud you and Black X in particular, who continue to advocate for the recognition of Chief Takyi and the impact it has made on our people. His fighting spirit is undoubtedly a significant contribution to the change in the mindset of not only our people, but instilling in slaves at that time the necessity to fight for our freedom. The spirit lives on in our people is a testimony of what we can accomplish once we make up our mind. That event in 1760, April the 7th, is a milestone. And if, Professor, this history and this heroic task of this one man who catalyzed so much of the insurrection that occurred around that period and after is not made a national hero, then I'm not sure who else should be. His legacy, his history, what he has done for this country is a testimony to what we as Jamaicans have come to accept, that we are fighters, we're strong-willed, we can accomplish what we will, irrespective of the yoke of slavery or any other yoke that is placed on our head or our necks. And therefore, I would hope, as a son of St. Mary, that this movement gathers a pace and it will move away from just a lecture series to catalyze the movement to make Takyi a hero. I really wish this series a success, and I hope that all the persons who are participating will come to recognize that this man
I lost a little bit of what Dr. Dunn said at the very end, but as you probably all know, he's a doctor of pharmacy. And I think you can hear from his stirring words that he has the prescription for our solution that will help us to get going on this plan to ensure that Takyi is made a national hero. We need to move forward with some serious bush medicine as well as the conventional medicine to make sure this happens. So we now move from Southeast St. Mary to St. Mary Central. And Dr. Murray Guy, the MP for that area, is now going to bring his greetings.
Good evening, moderator, Dr. Cooper. Good evening, Prof. Good evening, our guest speaker and all members here on this platform. We have moved away because of COVID from the regular St. Mary Parish Library celebrations that we usually have this time of year. But what is significant is that we have not lost the fight to have Takyi given his rightful place in the history of the Jamaican people. Technology has allowed us to continue the fight that has been started many years ago. And I want at the outset to congratulate not only the Department of Preparation Studies at the University of the West Indies, and pardon me, because I will write the prescription and Dr. Dunn will fill it at the university, and also the Takyi Foundation in St. Mary. And at this point, I want to big up Black X, who has been the fighter in modern day St. Mary, for the man who has put St. Mary on the map of not only Jamaica, but the world. Many people in St. Mary, when you remember the names Frontier, Trinity, Esher, Ballards Valley, Haywood Hall, Friendship, will only think of them as places of abode that we now live in and we do business in. But many do not recall the historical significance of this as it relates to the endeavors of Takyi in 1760 in the Takyi War, which sought to bring freedom to the oppressed slaves in Jamaica. And today we honor that memory of that great Akan chieftain who has brought not only honor to the people of St. Mary, the island of Jamaica, but indeed the international, in fact, the entire world. But also the recognition that the injustices which were meted out to anyone is and will not be tolerated. That the bondage of people for whatever gains will not be sanctioned, and that there is no justice. Where there is no justice, there can be no peace. A common theme which has guided modern civil rights movements and has guided the fight for democracy even today in parts of the world. We are very proud of what Takyi has done for Jamaica. We are proud that indeed we as a group of people here are fighting to have recognition for what he has done in setting the pace for the eventual independence of Jamaica, and for us as people to come into our own beings with the recognition that is due and respected. So today, as we seek to honor it, I want again to congratulate those who have been behind the preparation, and let us continue on this fight to make Takyi one of our national heroes, because indeed he represents the finest among us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guy. We have a pharmacist and a physician, so we're well on the path of healing. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce a distinguished daughter of St. Mary, Professor Vereen Shepherd, historian, director of the Center for Reparation Research, and a co-host of this evening's lecture. Big up, Professor Shepherd, for all the work that you've been doing, and welcome you to give your remarks.
Thank you very much, Prof. Cooper. And just in case our Minister, Olivia Grange, should join, I want to say welcome. We'll see if she managed. She did promise to be here. And of course, I want to send shout out to those who couldn't be here. His Excellency Errol Johnson, Custos of St. Mary, His Worship the Mayor of Port Maria also. So I want to greet Honorable Minister Dr. Norman Dunn and thank him for his words, and also MP Dr. Maurice Guy. Of course, I'm so thrilled that our keynote speaker, Professor Vincent Brown, managed to put us in his calendar. We've been trying for a year now. I greet the head of the Department of History and Archaeology, Dr. Enrique Okenve, who so graciously agreed to have that department collaborate with the Center for Reparation Research on this event. And of course, my co-host, Black X, has done more than anyone else recently to bring visibility to Chief Tatch and the war he organized with the other Gold Coast chiefs, including Chief Jamaica. And I greet all speakers and attendees at this Chief Tatch lecture. I St. Mary me come from, yes, and I salute all my St. Mary people who have kept the lecture series going for close to 20 years. And those like Kabuma at Keru, my sister from the same district in which I was born, have used radio as a platform, and of course, her In Search of series to announce revolutionary actions and spirit of our freedom fighters. I have had the honor of delivering not one, but two of these annual Chief Tatch lectures in 2005 and 2019. And the research for those lectures opened my eyes even wider at colonial British brutality, colonial British perfection of the divide and rule, and the informer to be rewarded culture, and strengthened my resolve to fight for repatriate justice on behalf of Chief Takyi, as well as those deported, tortured, and hanged, among them James Sterling, Rodney Wellington, and Charles Brown. The colonial British suppressed the war, but not the fighting spirit of African people in Jamaica. And the present day British government can deny institutional racism and oppose reparation all they want. The truth will stand. I congratulate our keynote speaker for his research and his book, and for his generosity in agreeing at such short notice to deliver this lecture. I am eager to hear it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Professor Shepherd, giving us the historical context. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Derek Blackex Robinson. I met him by phone a few months ago when I was trying to arrange for the handing over of some books by the Black British author Alex Wheatle, born in England to Jamaican parents. He has written a wonderful novel for young adults about the Takyi uprising. And I got in touch with Blackex because I wanted him to facilitate the handing over of the books. The book is called Cane Warriors, and it is a powerful story. I sat down one Saturday afternoon and read it straight. I couldn't put it down. So, Blackex, I am proud of you for the work you have done over the years. You have trod from St. Mary to Kingston to get the authorities to listen to your cry for us to make Takyi our national hero. So big up, sir, and I look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, Moderator Cooper, Professor Cooper, and I say Sister Kaboom. We're always excited to see her here. Big up Dr. Guy, always in our corner. Dr. Dunn has come on and really been show some interest, but I really want to take this opportunity just to call some names, because I want it to be made clear that I am perhaps the last tenant to have taken up the effort. We should note that Professor Shepherd at one point had actually recommended Chief Takyi to be made a national hero. And the saying from the chairman of that committee was, we need some more evidence. So the move afoot is to show those evidence, and I really believe we have those evidence now. Brother Vincent is here, Sister Kabu is here, Professor Bird is with us, and others are joining. Now, before me, there was Muta, and of course there was Kabu, and right now there's a little CD out from a brethren named Jack Trench. Dr. Guy, you know him? He's from Islington. And when we speak about Chief Takyi and what has kept the story alive since 1760, it's really the folklore. And that is the significance of the falls. The Takyi Fall is very, very significant, because it's that folklore of resilience, never give up. When them say Takyi not dead, them no kill him at all. Lie them and tell upon him, and him a come back, come free. So that was the message that kept going from generations to generations. And to see Jack Trench just last year, who is about my age, to come up with the same narrative. It is amazing. And we also should remember Sister Alma Norman poem, Takyi the Chieftain Decided to Fight. A lot of us says, okay, we never hear about Takyi in school and Ray, but that poem is a poem of our school time. We were hearing it, but we were just not connecting it. And as Sister Kabu says on the program with Brother Hurley Taylor, who's another advocate, that what happened, we were cheering on the wrong side of the war. You remember, Kabu? So now we need to know which side of the war we are on. And it's our time for victory. Thank you very much. And Brother Vincent, I'm gonna listen to you. Okay, Sister Cooper, your time now.
Rakex, what a way your background festive, man. I tell you, you're celebrating balloon for days. Big up, big up, big up. My dear, we were having some technical difficulties, so my desktop wasn't working now. I was on my iPad, so I'm back on my desktop. So I feel better because I have a better view of what is happening. So, my sister friend Kabu, it is such a pleasure to welcome you to present one of your poems on this occasion. As many of you know, Kabu is the host of Running African on IRI FM. I love to tell her that it's a university she's running, and she should start registering students for our school and give them a degree after they listen to so many programs, because it is wonderful instruction that we get on her program. And her name, Kabu Matkeru, means she who is not afraid to speak truth to power. She who is not afraid to speak truth for power. And that is a well-chosen name, Kabu. I know your mother and your father never give you that name, but you decide, say, better take on this name because this name represents who you are. So big up, and we look forward to your poem.
Thank you so much, my sister friend Carolyn. I'm trying to unmute myself. All right. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, my sister friend Carolyn. The poem I'm going to read is from my book, of course, Making Kenke from Memory. It's a libation to Nitachi. Upon this sacred, angered ground, may his soul ever reign through all the spaces to be found in consecrated pain, to be sun disk and seventh moon, recalling there again the memories of ancestors hewn for the warrior slain. Between the seen and the unseen, moved like God on mission, he charged the vile Philistines' freedom is only plan. To burn, to free his kin and men, to see them there no slave. Too low the shouts, amen. Too deep slavery's grave. He's Nitachi in the storming. He holds night bark again. He's warrior in the morning. Burn, burn slavery's chain. From Whitehall to the vast Westland, he buried slavers by fire. Like warrior in the homeland, he's Nitachi, sire. In hills and valleys, free the shout, though the white Abeng is dead. Black men of war with white men mount the lottery on his head. He saw the maroon, Davy betrayed. From Islington he leapt, enslaved, no more, Tatchy, unmade. He's free, now resurrected. Thank you so much.
Resurrection indeed. There's a West African proverb that I always think of on occasions like these. You never truly die until no one remembers you. And as long as we have these ceremonies of remembering, we will keep alive our ancestors in memory. and for the children, because it's the next generation. We have to keep passing it on and passing it on and passing it on. And that is why it's so important for me now to be able to welcome Dr. Enrique Okenve, who is the head of the Department of History and Archaeology at the University of the West Indies. It's a pity that history is not a required subject for Jamaicans high school students. We have to push and keep making the point that, as Marcus Garvey reminded us, and so many other people have done, if you don't understand your history, you will not know where you are going, you know, and you have to put it in the language of the picnic. You have to say, if you don't know where you come from, you don't know where you go. You have to know your history. So Enrique, welcome.
Yes, thank you, Prof. Cooper. Thank you, Professor Cooper, and welcome everybody here. Welcome everybody in attendance, and especially welcome Professor Vincent Brown. You joined this event to listen to Prof. Vincent Brown, so I promise not to take too much of your time so the lecture can begin. But of course, it's necessary to say a few words about who Professor Vincent Brown is in case you don't know yet. I must say that Professor Vincent Brown's institutional bio is rather succinct. I look at it and I say that I realize that, okay, he is, his bio tells us that he's Charles Warren Professor of American History and Professor of African American Studies at Harvard University. I believe he's also acting director of the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History. His bio also tells us that he's the author of The Reaper's Garden, which was published in 2008 and has received multiple awards. He is also a multimedia historian. For those who think that history is just about reading and writing books, he proves the opposite, or he proves that it's much more than that. In fact, he is the author of the online interactive map titled Slave Revolt in Jamaica, 1760 to 1761, a cartographic narrative. And he is also the author of the award-winning documentary on Melville Herskovits titled Herskovits at the Heart of Blackness. I believe that's about it in terms of his institutional bio. His work, as one can research, shows is fundamentally focuses on the continuities and connections between the history of continental African peoples and the histories of Africans in the diaspora. And I believe today's lecture will reflect much of that. This is, of course, very much reflected in his most recent publication of special relevance to us here in Jamaica and the wider Caribbean, Tatch's Revolt. Today I learned a new thing, so the proper pronunciation is Tatch's. So let's call it then Tatch's Revolt, the study of an Atlantic slave war, published in 2019. That is his most recent publication. I first became aware of the existence of Professor Brown's latest publication through a Newsline article. But it was actually last year when I became much more familiarized with it, when my very close friend, Moji Anderson, gave me her only copy of the book for my birthday. She had not finished the book yet and was very much looking forward to reading it. But I guess friendship and love prevailed in the end, and she gifted it to me. And for that, I will be always grateful. Tatch's Revolt is indeed Professor Vincent Brown's amazing gift to all of us. No doubt it is a must read for students of history, but for the general public. Believe me, I'm not exaggerating. The book connects crucial historical developments across the Atlantic Ocean, from Africa to Europe, the Americas, and of course, the Caribbean. In his book, Professor Brown shows that the story of Tatch's Revolt, probably like other slave revolts in the Americas, was not an isolated or spontaneous event. Tatch, like other African-born enslaved men and women, were part of the Atlantic world way before he was captured and taken to Jamaica. Tatch used his knowledge and experience to his advantage in his struggle to regain freedom and minimize enslavers' oppression in Jamaica, the Caribbean, and the rest of the Americas. These connections that this publication establishes and clearly shows are connections that in the Department of History and Archaeology are very much familiar with. Many of our programs, obviously, and courses in particular, they do that. They connect different regions and the people's stories through a number of diverse history courses. In those courses, we obviously will look at different regions of the world where the ancestors of modern Caribbean citizens came from. And in that way, we recognize that our history, our story is interconnected to these regions and their peoples, just like theirs is connected to ours. His book, of course, has attracted much numerous praises. I can just very quickly read a few of them here. Brilliant, groundbreaking, Brown's profound analysis and revolutionary vision of the age of slave war from the too often overlooked Tatch's role to the better known Haitian Revolution give us an original view of the birth of modern freedom in the New World. That's by Cornel West. I have here somebody that you might be familiar with, and she says, a masterful interpretation of the roots of revolutionary action and of the inevitable response of African Jamaican men and women to the violence of the racist and brutal British imperial project, which renders slavery a perpetual state of war. This is by somebody named Professor Vereen Shepherd. Yes, that's her. And there are many old phrases here that actually, I think, do justice to this publication. His work, Professor Brown's work, is no doubt exciting and enlightening. If you don't know it yet, today's lecture will help you to see this and hopefully encourage you to buy, for example, and read Tatch's Revolt, but also to continue exploring the past, not just the past of Jamaica, but also the past of all those regions that have historical links with us, because as I mentioned before, the history, their history, the history of all the regions is also Jamaica's history, just like Jamaica's history is also part of their history. As I tell to my students of African history is yours, and I say to them, just like this story of Jamaica or the history of people and characters like Takyi is also mine. As I said at the beginning, Professor Vincent Brown's institutional bio is succinct. In fact, while there are numerous references to him and his work online, one cannot easily find the type of biographical information that is available for other historians and academics. Perhaps, and only perhaps, this is a sign of modesty, maybe a sign of confidence, a sign that Professor Vincent Brown prefers to let his work speak for itself. Professor Brown, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Okenve, for that very generous introduction. I'm really blessed to be with you here all tonight. I give thanks too for Professor Cooper, the Honorable Dr. Norman Dunn, Dr. Guy, Sister Kabu, for that fantastic, beautiful poem, but also to Ms. Annie Paul and Gabrielle Hemmings, who we'll be hearing from at the end of our night tonight, and dear Prof. Shepherd, for the invitation to speak with you. I'm very sorry that I couldn't be with you all in Jamaica, but I'm blessed that you have joined me online tonight. And I'm honored and grateful to have this opportunity to speak with you. I want to give a very special shout out to the one Derek Jamaica Black X Robinson for promoting historical awareness of Chief Tatch and his freedom struggle in the 18th century, which has much to tell us about the freedom struggles that continue, for which the Center for Reparations Research is an important part. The title of my talk today is Takyi's Revolt, or the Coromante War. And I want to acknowledge that I'm following an agenda laid out 4 decades ago by Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, your esteemed Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, in a short review essay that he published in the Jamaica Historical Review in 1982. Where he wrote that resistance by the enslaved in the Caribbean should be considered part of a 200 years war against the institution of slavery. Scholarship on slavery and resistance is forever in his debt, and I'm fortunate to have his example to follow, as you all are truly blessed by his leadership at the University of the West Indies. Beckles' suggestion that we see uprisings of the enslaved as episodes in a long war also implies that we expand our vision beyond singular figures. So this evening, I want to talk less about Chief Tatch himself than about the broader context of his war and what consequences it had beyond Jamaica. We know, and we've known partly through the work of people like Black X and all those people who carried on the folklore of Chief Tatch for so many generations, a bit more about what he has done in Jamaica. I want to expand the canvas and talk about how important, how significant the events instigated by Chief Tatch were for really the whole of the Atlantic world, to tie these regions together. So let me share my screen. And we can begin. Few people know that in 1776, Great Britain's most important American colony was on the verge of insurrection. Colonists perceived that the government in Britain was conspiring against the rights of imperial subjects. They feared a plot against the English liberties they had long enjoyed. At their dinner tables, they heatedly discussed the merits of open sedition. Those disaffected with imperial governance dwelled upon the topic of American rebellion. And as these Jamaican colonists debated liberty, their slaves saw an opportunity. The island was at a critical juncture with the British entry into yet another imperial war. Colonists traded exaggerated accounts of a French and Spanish military buildup in the Caribbean and calculated that there were 30 slaves to every white person ready to join the attempts at any enemy in a general massacre, they said. On July 3rd, a regiment of troops left Hanover Parish for a rendezvous at Port Royal, scheduled to depart the island for North America by the end of the month. Throughout that parish, enslaved people gathered frequently in houses, grounds, and open fields to hold very serious conversations, which stopped suddenly upon the approach of anyone they did not trust. They were strategizing. Now or never, they thought, was the time to make themselves masters of the island. The moment seemed ripe for a successful uprising, but this American Revolution was not to be. As so often happened with slave rebellions, the plot was betrayed and the conspiracy unraveled. But when the British in Jamaica considered the gravity of their predicament in 1776, rather than looking ahead to the loss of the 13 colonies on the North American continent, they looked to the past, back to the slave insurrection of 1760, which had been the most dangerous threat to the British Empire to date. They reflected on the differences between the unrest of 1760 and 1776, mostly in terms of the nature of warfare with their own slaves. In April 1760, as you know, an enslaved West African chief called Takyi staged a massive uprising against brutal conditions on Jamaica, then the most profitable colony of Great Britain's 26 American colonies. Over the next 18 months, as their numbers grew into the thousands, the rebels thwarted an initial crackdown, conducting a skillful guerrilla campaign against the might of the British Empire. Plantations were destroyed. Dozens of whites were killed. It was a war within a war. As Britain fought for imperial supremacy in Europe's first global conflict, the 7 Years' War, then raging across 5 continents, enslaved Black people fought to throw off the violent yoke of colonial rule. Shaken by the scale of these revolts, Britain's colonial forces eventually responded with overwhelming force, killing and brutally executing at least 500 Black men, women, and children. Hundreds more people were transported from the island for life. But the brutal British response could not contain the revolt's consequences, which included an amplification of anti-Black racism, the emergence of a movement to abolish the slave trade, and perhaps most surprisingly, a reorganization of the British Empire that provoked another rebellion on the North American continent. "1776 customarily marks a moment in the origin of the United States of America, of course, when the Declaration of Independence announced the separation of the 13 colonies from Great Britain. When referring to the origins of that nation, though, the date obscures the broader context of the times. It deflects attention from the fact that Britain held 26 colonies in America, not just the 13 that broke away, and that by far the most profitable, militarily significant, and best politically connected of them were in the Caribbean. This chart here compares private wealth in various regions of Great Britain's empire in 1774. It divides the territories into England and Wales, British America as a whole, and then the 13 North American colonies that became the United States, those in the British Caribbean, and then it divides the 13 colonies into 3 different regions: Southern, Mid-Atlantic, and New England. Now, as you can see, colonists on the continent held nearly 70% of the wealth in British America as a whole, largely because the total population of property holders was much greater than in the Caribbean. But when you break North America down by region, you see that wealth increased as you move south. That is, according to the degree the colonial economy depended upon enslaved labor. And when you examine the average amount of property held per free white person, an astonishing disparity leaps out. In the British Caribbean, where some 90% of the population was made up of enslaved Black people, free white people were stupendously rich, boasting more than 17 times the wealth of those in the 13 colonies. Indeed, the average private wealth of a free colonist in Jamaica, the single most lucrative American colony, was nearly 58 times greater than that of a similar settler in New England. Military deployments were distributed to protect that wealth. The Royal Navy kept its 3 main stations at Port Royal, Jamaica, established in 1696, English Harbor, Antigua from 1731, and Halifax, Nova Scotia after 1749, 2 in the Caribbean and 1 in North America. Often, there were nearly as many warships assigned to Jamaica as to the whole of the North American continent. Jamaica's planters and merchants wielded greater influence in the imperial metropolis than their North American peers, which does go some way to explaining why poor Governor Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts couldn't get as much support as he needed as soon as he wanted from British policymakers when rebels rose up in that marginal colony in the 1770s. Before that American Revolution, the British were well aware that the event we now know as Takyi's Revolt represented the peak of imperial crisis, and slave revolt was generally a source of overwhelming concern. One planter who many of you will know about, who had lived through the upheaval, wrote that whether we consider the extent and secrecy of its plan, the multitude of the conspirators, or the difficulty of opposing its eruptions in such a variety of places at once, this revolt was more formidable than any hitherto known in the West Indies. According to 2 slaveholders who wrote histories of the Jamaican conflict, one of them being Edward Long, pictured here, the rebellion was organized and executed principally by people called Koramontis from the Gold Coast, the West African region stretching between the Como and Volta rivers, who had an established reputation for military prowess. Their displacement, forced migration, and rebellion shows how the slave trade itself shaped what I call the diasporic warfare that convulsed the 18th century Atlantic world. The transatlantic slave trade spread people from Atlantic Africa throughout the Americas. Some who had been leaders or soldiers suddenly found themselves uprooted from sustaining landscapes, scattered by currents and trade winds, and replanted in unfamiliar territories where they labored to rebuild their social lives. Inevitably, some of them determined that only war could end their bondage. This process of dispersal from a native land, transplantation, and adaptation to a new and strange one is familiar to students of cultural change. We understand that when we think about music, because people have examined transformations in African religion, expression, and identity by viewing African, American, and Atlantic history in a common frame. A similar approach shows how the turmoil of enslavement and the daily hostilities of life in plantation society generated a militant response that traveled, took root, and sprouted in rebellions that reverberated across the Americas and back to Europe. That is what happened when those called Koramontis broke out in a series of revolts and conspiracies in the 17th and 18th centuries, most dramatically in Cartagena, Suriname, St. John, New York, Antigua, and Jamaica, an archipelago of insurrection stretching throughout the North Atlantic Americas. The Jamaican insurrections of 1760 and into 1761, followed by further uprisings in 1765 and 66, were among the largest and most consequential of these. From what observers could glean of the aims and tactics of the rebels, it was clear that many had been soldiers in Africa. Perhaps whole cadres of people arrived in the Americas with military training and discipline, or at least some knowledge of defensive and evasive tactics learned in Africa. Indeed, as some scholars suggest, American slave revolts might be seen in some key respects as extensions of African wars. Viewing slave revolt as a species of warfare is in this way the first step to envisioning a map of Atlantic slavery that shows how political and military practices traveled, took root, and grew in disparate environments. For even as the slave trade forced people to remake and renegotiate their affiliations, the massive dispersal of Africans across the Atlantic scattered the seeds of military conflict throughout the Americas. The story of the Koramontis shows how African warfare was reconstituted, not as a direct continuation of previous struggles, but as an outgrowth of immigrant experiences. British slaveholders valued Koramontis highly. People stereotyped them as best suited for agricultural labor, and they had reputations for military bearing and discipline. They were often employed in command and supervisory roles in plantation work gangs, and sometimes they played subservient roles in the armed forces, including in the Royal Navy. But the British also said that Koramontis were particularly rebellious and prone to uprisings. They were dangerous people to keep in bondage, in part for the same reason slave traders found the Gold Coast to be an abundant source of potential workers. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the region witnessed the transformation of major empires of its own, Dinshira, Akwamu, Akyem, and Ashanti, among dozens of smaller polities, which vied with each other in the region. The battles that attended these contests produced great quantities of war captives for sale to the Europeans on the coast. They also produced a turbulent environment in which complex military campaigns involved both European and African rivalries, multiple alliances, negotiations, and treachery. In fact, people from the Gold Coast did not form anything like a single ethnic group in Africa. So who were the Koramontis? According to the best research on the subject, they were members of a loosely structured organization of co-nationals who socialized with and aided one another, forming what contemporaries called a nation in the Americas. As a basis of social communion, in an environment where militarism was a common experience, national gatherings could also provide a forum for people to plan, organize, and stage revolts. When they did so, they drew upon their previous military experiences. However, as what you might call a category of belonging, Coromante was cross-cut by many other axes of identification. Koramontis spoke more than one language and came from many different regions and kingdoms, from which they brought a variety of historical experiences. Just as importantly, once in Jamaica, they served different roles in the slave society. So no amount of cultural similarity could resolve all the difficult negotiations of multiple interests and experiences among them. Even with their compatriots, enslaved Africans made friends and foes through a politics of belonging that made the debate about what it meant to be Coromante in Jamaica as urgent as the forging of that identity itself. In the face of continual assaults on their personal dignity, the enslaved distinguished themselves by their political commitments as much as by ascribed classifications. Among the Koramontis, different ideas about how to live in slave society, how to evade its worst abuses, and how to destroy it altogether shaped their rebellions even as they recalled their prior experiences in Africa. In the turbulent world of Atlantic warfare, nothing was more important than learning where and how to form loyal units, alliances, and coalitions in the face of superior power. The enslaved had won this wisdom through hard experience on the Gold Coast before coming to America, where they learned it anew and with different particulars in order to make war on their masters. The former slave and Royal Navy veteran, Olaudah Equiano, famously defined slavery itself as a perpetual state of war. This was not war in the conventional sense between distinct armies directed by the rulers of states. Rather, mastery was by nature a forceful assault, to be met with simmering violence ignited by resentment against the fraud, rapine, and cruelty of slaveholders. To the enslavers, Equiano asked, "Are you not hourly in dread of an insurrection?" And it was not a rhetorical question. Since the early years of Jamaica's slave society, slaveholders had often considered the enslaved as irreconcilable and yet intestine enemies, made subject to the colonists only by the rule of the whip. Equiano had been in Jamaica in 1772, when the island was still reeling from the uprisings of the previous decade. There he had seen how an entire world could be organized around violence and counterattack. He held this view in common with Black people in other times and places, where the enslaved often characterized their bondage as a permanent state of low-intensity war, talking regularly about how they might wage that war. This description might be more familiar now to many people than it would have been a generation ago. Military theorists have become increasingly interested in warfare between great powers and improvised militias, conflict dispersed over wide areas, with largely undefined battle lines and blurred distinctions between civilians and combatants. So these current trends in the study of warfare recommend a re-examination of the martial geography of Atlantic slavery too. Warfare migrates. This has never been more apparent than in the era when the violence of imperial expansion and enslavement transformed Europe, Africa, and the Americas as they interacted across the Atlantic Ocean. European imperial conflicts extended the dominion of capitalist agriculture. African battles fed captives to the transatlantic trade in slaves. Masters and their human property struggled with one another continuously. These clashes amounted to what I call a borderless slave war. War to enslave, war to expand slavery, and war against slaves, precipitating wars waged by the enslaved against slaveholders. And in this sense, Chief Tatch's revolt was but a war within other wars, which had diverging and overlapping provocations, combat zones, political alliances, and enemy combatants. In effect, it combined 4 wars at once. It was an extension of those wars on the African continent. It was a race war between Black slaves and white slaveholders. It was a struggle among Black people over the terms of their communal belonging, for effective control of local territory and the establishment of their own political legacies. And it was most immediately one of the hardest fought battles of the 7 Years' War, that titanic global conflict between Great Britain and its European rivals. Each of these 4 struggles emerged from different currents that converged and eddied in the Jamaican insurrections of the 1760s. Charting their course suggests new stories of place, territory, and movement, a new cartography of slave revolt that braids together the histories of Europe, Africa, and America. Some of you will know this villain, Thomas Thistlewood, the Westmoreland overseer who kept a diary of his exploits over 36 years in 18th century Jamaica. And he left us an example. One of the revolt's principal leaders, a man called Wager, also known by his African name Apongo, who fought in each kind of these campaigns that I've mentioned. He was an elite official on the Gold Coast, trading with British forts and probably engaging in combat with political rivals. Captured and enslaved by a Royal Navy ship captain, he fought in naval battles against the French, alongside other Africans from the Gold Coast on the same ship. He was one among dozens of other Black mariners employed at Jamaica, who constituted about a quarter of all the crews plying the island's shipping lanes at the time. After Wager's discharge from the warship, he was a driver on that captain's sugar plantation for a time, before he came to lead an uprising that the British could fairly call a race war. As he engaged in these successive struggles, he connected the small-scale, everyday violence of enslavement and coerced labor to the grand scale of imperial geopolitics. The hemispheric reach of each of these conflicts mapped interlocking patterns of state, commerce, migration, labor, and militancy. Across vast distances, these wars within wars connected the constituent elements of empire, diaspora, and insurrection. Such an integrated history of slave revolt takes us far from the plantations, beyond relations between masters and slaves, and outside the conventional locations for observing racial violence. Vectors of slave war in Jamaica formed a knot in the intertwined itineraries of soldiers who fought in Europe, North America, and Africa, sailors who crisscrossed the Atlantic world for merchants and empires, and the enslaved, who were swept up in many conflicts on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, I'm going to hope that at least some of you will read my account of Chief Tatch's revolt for yourselves. You can get a glimpse of the way it unfolded on these maps, which are in the book. And as you see, it kind of unfolded in St. Mary, as we know, but then extended into Westmoreland in a much longer phase of the revolt that lasted on into 1761. So for now, let me just sketch some of what I think are the underappreciated reverberations to give you a sense of why this insurrection was not without result, as many people thought, and how I hope that the story I've told can model the kinds of connections that braid events in distant locales across long spans of time and connect up the events that we know as Chief Tatch's revolt with a world history that is more consequential than I think most people realize. Takyi's revolt anticipated the American Revolution by a decade and a half and the Haitian Revolution by 3 decades. It can be considered one of the first great events of what historians call the Age of Revolution. And yet, it's hardly known outside Jamaica to people who aren't historians of the British Empire or Atlantic slavery. This is despite the fact that it influenced 2 of the signal moments of the era, movements of the era, the reorganization of British imperial governance that so irritated colonists in North America, and the early beginning of the movement to abolish the transatlantic slave trade, which finally culminated in 1807 in Britain. In the aftermath of the revolt, to recoup some of the public costs, Jamaica's House of Assembly passed new poll taxes and new commercial duties. The colonial government also committed to a tax on vellum, parchment, and paper ascertained by stamps, something that imperial reformers would attempt a few years later for all of America. The Jamaica Stamp Act of 1760 was meant explicitly to address the costs of the revolt, and that tax continued in force until December 1763, when it was repealed as too great a burden for all but the wealthiest colonists. But as a model for the more contentious 1765 Stamp Act that would rile the colonists in North America, the 1760 tax was an early local instance of a far larger reform effort stimulated by the 7 Years' War. As imperial policymakers celebrated military victories in North America, Africa, and the Caribbean, they contemplated the threat to their most vital colony. On November 7, 1760, 2 weeks after the death of King George II, the Board of Trade considered official accounts of the Jamaican insurrection, which raised the urgent question of how an expanding empire might contain its internal antagonists. In this liminal moment for imperial management, a new policy would take shape. British statesmen had worried over the governance of America for more than a decade, since the conclusion of the previous war with France and Spain in 1748. The colony's demographic, economic, and strategic value had increased dramatically in the first half of the 18th century, and the complexity of administering them had grown in tandem. British members of parliament were spurred into a reform effort, partly by the behavior of North American colonists during the 7 Years' War. Because in the midst of that conflict, colonial assemblies flouted the authority of governors. Elected officials allowed flagrant violations of the Navigation Acts against trading with the enemy. And colonists often failed to supply enough local troops and resources to the war effort. As historians have explained, this coincided with a dramatic shift from an essentially permissive to a fundamentally restrictive philosophy of colonial administration in London. amplifying the widespread conviction that the colonies had too many privileges and that these privileges ought to be reduced. News of the slave war in Britain's most profitable colony strengthened the policymakers' resolve, and in this they were helped by a shift in attitude among colonists in Jamaica. Jamaican colonists had been previously as restive and independent as their North American counterparts, but the slave insurrection reminded slaveholders of the benefits of empire. They soon conveyed their gratitude, along with a request for more troops, to the new king, George III, and the Lords of Trade. The Colonial Assembly thanked the king. If not for His Majesty's forces, they wrote, the lives and properties of your loyal subjects would, in all likelihood, have become a prey to their slaves, and that's the quote. Like North American colonists, slaveholders in Jamaica resented the influence of metropolitan intervention, as well as the imposition of new taxes. However, unlike so many in North America, their recent experience with slave revolt encouraged them to remain duly subject to imperial command, even passing that Stamp Act to finance their own security. They did not like many imperial reforms, but they acquiesced to them. After the 7 Years' War, with Jamaica having served as a model for the assertion of imperial control, policymakers preferred a raft of new legislation for their North American colonies. Yet unlike colonial Jamaican colonists' submission, these policies inspired the well-known backlash that would ultimately split the British Empire in 1776. So yes, I am arguing that Chief Tatch's revolt had an indirect effect on the cause of the American Revolution. So if the Jamaican insurrections helped to shape imperial policy toward the colonies, they also offered a rationale for the reform of colonial slavery itself. Fearing further rebellion, concerned Britons put forth pragmatic plans for enhancing the security of the colonies by limiting their dependence on the slave trade and ameliorating the condition of the enslaved. Ironically, perhaps perversely, the work of the historian planter Edward Long had a significant impulse on a budding anti-slavery discourse. Long argued that slave revolt was a criminal trait of the Coromante people, and his fearful hatred of Coromontes fed his loathing for Africans in general. Indeed, through a chain of association linking various what he thought were unwelcome traits, Blackness in general came to signify the general potential for danger that Long attributed most specifically to Coromontes. In the end, regardless of their differences, Long thought that Black people must actually constitute a different species of humankind. Now, for this view, he has been called an early proponent of scientific racism, and was, which gained currency in the 18th century as writers sought to classify and rank the world's peoples. More immediately, though, Long's racism was as much a specific reaction to Black political agency as it was a general theory of human difference. His views projected his experience of the fragility of white mastery in the West Indies, where slaveholders had recently been frustrated, at times even humiliated, in their attempts to pacify the enslaved. Though he thought that slavery was unavoidably necessary, in his terms, for the increase of English commerce, he viewed the African presence as an unqualified evil. One of the more enduring myths in the corpus of racial fantasy is that white people are underdogs, besieged by hypermasculine and ultra-violent Black people. Slave revolt engendered this trope. In his reaction to Jamaica's slave war in the 1760s, Long became one of the most erudite and prominent purveyors of racial panic, nurturing a virulent strain of nationalist discourse that would infect the political imagination of many whites down to the present day. In arguing that the principal threat to colonial slavery were African and especially Coromante insurgents, Long promoted the idea that a native-born slave population would be more tractable. Long thought that if planters could avoid working their slaves to death, as they often did, attach them to estates rather than continuing to scatter them by sale, as they generally did, establish better conditions for child rearing, as they almost never did, and encourage the progress of Christianity, then slaveholders might be more secure in their possessions. They could also save money on the ever-rising prices of imported laborers from Africa, raising up native-born populations would facilitate what reformers constantly referred to as the improvement of the plantations, and would lead to a kinder and gentler and less menacing slavery. Through the beginning of the 19th century, people who campaigned against the slave trade would invoke Long's text to argue that ending the traffic would enhance the internal security of the British Empire. And in this way, Jamaica's turbulence indirectly helped to nurture the emerging anti-slave trade movement. Fear of Africans had indeed inspired the first efforts to restrict the transatlantic slave trade. Responding to a 1712 African uprising in nearby New York, the Pennsylvania Colonial Assembly imposed a prohibitive 20-pound duty on slave importations, citing what they called diverse plots and insurrections, not only in the islands, but on the mainland of North America as the reason for their action. After a revolt near South Carolina's Stono River in 1739, that colony enacted a 10-year moratorium on the importation of Africans, but planters soon found they could not do without them. Amid news of Jamaica's troubles in the 1760s, other colonies tried again. Virginia's legislators attempted to levy increased taxes on imported slaves in 1767, 1769, and 1772. As Virginia's governor explained to British officials, colonists had just cause to apprehend the most dangerous consequence of importing Africans and should find means, they said, not only of preserving their increase, but also of lessening their number. He believed that the interests of the country would manifestly require the total expulsion of them. Influenced more by merchant interests than by colonial concerns, London disallowed all three of these Virginia duty acts. But restrictions on the slave trade were more successful in Pennsylvania. In 1761, with news of Jamaica's slave war appearing regularly in the Pennsylvania Gazette, the colony passed a law to increase the import duties on slaves and extend its enforcement in perpetuity. In 1773, Pennsylvania doubled the taxes, and finally in 1780, the colony passed an act for the gradual abolition of slavery. As much as these laws might have expressed increasing opposition to the practice of slaveholding, they were also security measures aimed at discouraging the arrival of potentially insurgent Africans like Chief Tatch. If most white colonists feared the presence of Africans, many others empathized with their plight. In the abolition movement's early beginnings, African rebels sometimes drew sympathetic responses, especially from people in places that held fewer numbers of slaves than in the Caribbean. Many British and North American readers were more horrified by the brutality of their British co-nationals than by the violence of the rebels. Accounts of the execution circulated more widely, with the growing popularity of sentimental literature and Christian martyrology in Britain, which helped the British to imagine their nation as a moral community founded in persecution, death, and religious virtue. For some, this imagined moral community extended to include the enslaved, however tenuously, and African rebels came to be seen as victims sacrificed to the cruel tyranny of slaveholders, as you see here in an early poem by the writer and Jamaica slaveholder Brian Edwards. One pamphlet that circulated during the 1760 revolt, J. Fillmore's Two Dialogues on the Man Trade, argued that given the terrors of enslavement, nature's higher law authorized violence against enslavers. And I'm quoting at length, "All the Black men now on our plantations who are by unjust force deprived of their liberty and held in slavery, as they have none upon earth to appeal to, may lawfully repel that force with force, and to recover their liberty, destroy their oppressors. And not only so, but it is the duty of others, white as well as Black, to assist those miserable creatures if they can in their attempts to deliver themselves out of slavery and to rescue them out of the hands of their cruel tyrants." Now, few others were willing to go this far, at least in print. But the pamphlet influenced Anthony Benezet, the Pennsylvania Quaker, who laid the intellectual foundations for slave trade abolition in the British Empire among policymakers and in the movement. Although he avoided the topic of slave revolts, Benezet frequently invoked higher law doctrine against the trade in human beings. Among his fellow Quakers, a fervent opposition to war induced them to see the violence stimulated by slave trading as an unconscionable evil. Their belief that the slave trade was a constant source of war was an orthodox line of reasoning through the early 19th century. Even some who could not condone slave revolt condemned slaveholder tyranny. In 1764, a Boston writer asserted that West Indian planters were used to an arbitrary and cruel government over their slaves, having for so long tasted the sweets of oppressing their fellow creatures. That sentiment reverberated strongly in James Otis's Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved, published the same year. His defense of the rights of American settlers from the intimidation of imperial administration declared that colonists are by the law of nature freeborn, as indeed all men are, white or black. In England, people mocked American colonists' pretensions to being oppressed by invoking their brutality toward the enslaved. In the early years of the American Revolution, the literary celebrity Samuel Johnson famously raised a toast to the next slave rebellion in the West Indies at an Oxford dinner party. So by the end of the century, stories of revolts against slaveholders and the gruesome executions of slave rebels had helped to promote an emerging anti-slavery consciousness, which ultimately enabled the campaigns that turned the British public against the slave trade and slavery in the 19th century. But this all happened too late for the rebels themselves. Like most insurrection, Tatch's war ended badly. The insurgents were killed or captured, publicly executed in grisly displays, or banished from the island, probably along with many bystanders who had taken no part in the fighting. Looking back with a historian's perspective, one can see that the outcome was never really in doubt. The balance of forces doomed the rebellion from the start. The Koramontis would not win the colony from the British, as the North Americans would do 2.5 decades later, and as the Haitians would do by 1804, taking Saint-Domingue from the French. But the rebels in Jamaica did not know they would fail. They acted with the hope of success. Even amid the business of war and enslavement, in a colony garrisoned for battle with foreign and domestic enemies, they could find fissures in the landscape of planter power beyond the reach of the slaveholders' whips. They could even challenge the combined forces of the British Empire and find an enduring place in popular memory. Tatch's revolt and its reverberations through the 1760s represented a watershed in the course of Atlantic history, as well as Jamaican history. If regional political maps had been drawn by the wars that opened new territories for cultivation, stimulated the slave trade, and enhanced state power, the slave rebellions etched another record of historical movement. They channeled people into new solidarities and gave meaning to categories of belonging, partitioned friends from foes and bystanders, and redirected the priorities of governing authorities. Since Jamaica was the commercial and military hub of the British American Empire, its most profitable settlement and most powerful overseas military stronghold, what happened there was bound to reverberate widely. Yet the legacies of the 1760s are ambiguous. At the close of the 7 Years' War, Britain kept its prize colony, though Takyi's revolt helped to stimulate an imperial reform effort that provoked a greater challenge on the North American continent. If the Jamaican revolts in some ways anticipated the Haitian Revolution, offering a beacon of hope to the enslaved, they also left Black people divided. The Koramontis augmented their reputation as formidable fighters, helping to cast doubts on the wisdom of continuing the transatlantic slave trade, while at the same time strengthening the association in white minds between Blackness and social danger. Even in the United States, as late as the mid-19th century, anxious slaveholders would refer to potential troublemakers as Takyis among us. Perhaps the ambiguous nature of these legacies helps to explain why they register so faintly in the imagination today beyond Jamaica. The Coromante wars that shaped the era don't fit neatly into the prevailing narrative of the rise and progress of liberal freedom, even though such small, dirty wars epitomize the relationship between labor, commerce, and global power as they still do today. They are obscured by the more obvious consequences of the American and Haitian revolutions, which seem to speak seem to speak more directly to the Western history of liberty. The relative obscurity of these events is also due to the reluctance to acknowledge slave revolt as an act of war, even 40 years after Professor Sir Hilary Beckles told us that we should. Few things terrify the wealthy and powerful more than the prospect of losses to the poor and the weak, which would signify a world turned upside down. Dominant peoples and nation states develop elaborate conventions for legitimating conflict, maintaining their honor in victory and defeat, and recognizing violence as a regular, if unfortunate, feature of political struggle. But between the powerful and those they dominate by daily habit, there is no limit to the lengths they may go to maintain their supremacy. They will commit atrocities and massacres, to be sure, but they will disavow them too. They will refuse to admit that their combatants are legitimate enemies, and they will denigrate the past and present struggles of less powerful peoples. Because slaveholders wrote the first draft of this history, subsequent historiography has strained to escape from their point of view. What we must fully recognize, and what I hope I've conveyed tonight, is how events in far-flung and seemingly disconnected places had consequences in other ostensibly isolated locales. How the process of forced migration from Africa in a world of imperial warfare shaped the history of America in surprising ways. The uprisings of the 1760s in Jamaica can justly be narrated as stories of heroism and defeat. But in their courage and ingenuity, these insurgents also charted the landscape of force and its limitations that the maps of the powerful never meant to show. These countermappings reveal a geography of hope and possibility in the making, fugitive territories carved out through political struggle that were difficult to maintain and are in most places yet to be won. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Brown, for that brilliant lecture. It is so powerful the way you make the connections across seemingly disparate spaces. And I particularly like that notion of the dread that the American plantation owners felt for new coming Africans, because they knew they came with a revolutionary spirit of people who refused to be enslaved. Indigenization of slavery in some ways may have tempered the rebellious energy, but the fresh blood was coming with power, which they feared. I want to particularly welcome the Honorable Minister Babsy Grange, Olivia Babsy Grange. I believe you're in the house. Welcome, Minister of Culture, Gender, Entertainment, and Sport. Happy to have you on this celebratory occasion. So now it's time to open up the conversation to those of you who want to ask questions. I think somebody's going to be sending me the information on who to call on. Am I right? You should just hold up your hand. We have 71 participants, and I'm sure several of you have questions for Professor Brown.
So perhaps they can put it in the chat. Let me look at the chat, and I'm sure Gabriel is also doing that, and John.
Monitor, yes.
Yes, so that we can see if there are questions. But we're seeing comments, you know, like a real eye-opener for me.
Yes.
Of information to share. I have read the book and it was marvelous, somebody else says. People are sending greetings. People are saying, time to take action. So many years of lectures. The evidence is so clear. The evidence is so clear. Let us, I suppose, elevate Chief to, you know, the status of national. But while people are putting their question. If you allow me, Madam Moderator.
Absolutely,
Yes,
Madam Co-host.
You know, Vincent, thank you so much for this brilliant lecture. And I wanted to repeat, I think, what I said. I mean, I am so happy you asked me for a blurb line, and just listening to you again, and I know, we have spoken before, but I reinforce what I said, a masterful interpretation of the roots, R-O-O-T-S and R-O-U-T-E-S, of revolutionary action and of the inevitable response of African Jamaican men and women to the violence of the imperial project, and which rendered them always perpetually at war. Because this for me was what I got from your masterful recollection and connection and actually just narrating and analyzing what happened. You answered one of my questions. I was going to ask you if you wanted to make a more direct link between the War of 1760 and the Haitian Revolution. So many people ask that question. I think every historian has been asked that question, but you answered it. And thank you for making those connections. But the other question that we're always asked is, you mentioned that they were deported or they transported in the language of the day. And people are always asking, to where? Where did they send them? Can you at least shed some light on that?
So, yeah. So I can. I mean, the first answer is, the planters in Jamaica wanted to send them anywhere they could. Just get them out of Jamaica was their idea. But they had particular places where they could go. As you know, and as some others do, in the 18th century, the Jamaican governor also administered the territory of what was British Honduras then, what is now Belize, where they had logwood plantations. And so a number of these exiles were shipped to British Honduras. And there was another rebellion there in 1765. Historians think, and I think quite plausibly, that many of those people involved in the 1765 rebellion in British Honduras had been veterans of Chief Tatchy's War, of the insurrections of the 1760s in Jamaica. We know that some of them were smuggled to Saint-Domingue, right? And I'm going to say something about that in a minute, but we know that they carried the story with them to Saint-Domingue before it was revolutionary Haiti. I was able to track a number of shiploads of people to South Carolina and to Virginia as well. And I think the important thing to note here is something that Brother Black X alluded to in his remarks, which is that these people carried that story with them. They told the story to others, right? They weren't, they didn't go to Virginia and South Carolina and British Honduras and Saint-Domingue and forget. And one reason we know that is we have documented evidence that this story of Takyi's Revolt was still being told in St. Mary 40 years, 50 years after the events of the 1760s. I talk about this in the book, but just briefly for the listeners. In 1806, one major planter named Simon Taylor had received a shipment of brand new captives from Africa to his plantation in St. Mary. And at some point, he realized they rose up and they attempted to stab their driver. So he locked them all up and he interrogated them. And in his interrogations, he discovered that they had all been in communication with people on Frontier Plantation. And he said they all know of the events that happened here in 1760 and 1765, before any of the enslaved people that are now on Frontier Plantation were born. And these were brand new arrivals to the island that were learning the political history of Jamaica, an oppositional political history of Jamaica, taught and learned on Jamaican plantations in St. Mary by the enslaved, right? To each other, to future generations. That history, I think, I see this as one of the questions in the chat, is the major unexplored question that I think historians have. How can we trace the folklore among the enslaved that came down to the present day? because I give thanks to Black X for promoting this story and advocating for Takyi to be named a national hero, but he gives thanks to those people who kept that folklore alive in the parish of St. Mary. That story has always been there, right? That is the story I think historians need to learn how to tell, so that we can really understand Black political history from Black perspectives, right? From the story, the perspectives that we have been telling and learning from each other for a very long time.
So, Prof. Cooper, I don't know if are you looking at the chat, Prof. Cooper? The questions are.
Yes, there are 25 comments in the chat, yes.
There's one about at the risk of being overly provocative. Have you seen that one?
Yes, I would
Yes.
like to get Professor Brown's perspective as to the extent to which Jamaican Maroons joining forces with the British forces determined the outcome of the Takyi revolt.
Yeah. So I mean, this is a sensitive question in Jamaica. I know it's not a sensitive question for me as an American standing outside of it. I kind of look at the story as I see it. But I think the thing that has to be remembered is that if one wants to take Black politics seriously, one also has to look at conflicts between and among Black people. There's no way around that, right? That Black people don't always automatically share the same interests, even in a slave society. So that's a kind of framing gesture for what I have to say about the Maroons themselves. As you know very well, in the first Maroon War in the 1730s, the Maroons fought the British to a standstill, so much so the British didn't even know that they would be able to keep the island. And that's why they signed that treaty in 1739 and into 1740, right? Which granted the Maroons their autonomy from the British slave state, right? That's how they maintained their freedom. But it was a diplomatic treaty, which, as many of you know, also required the Maroons to police future slave revolts, which many, but not all of them did. And so when we get to 1760 in Takyi's revolt, we find that the Maroons are instrumental to suppressing the revolt because they have more and better experience tracking and fighting in the bush and in the mountains. British militia and British soldiers don't do that well. They don't know how. It's the Africans with the military experience that can do that fighting. Now the Maroons, as they see it, are adhering to their part of a diplomatic bargain in order to maintain their autonomy and their freedom, right? And that happens in the case of Takyi's revolt to mean that they are going to be opposed to the revolt. Now, I will say that I found evidence that the Maroons disagreed among themselves, right? So the Maroons of what became Trelawney Town, right, did suppress the revolt in Westmoreland pretty actively, but the Maroons in Accompong Down did not. One can see from the maps when one looks at how the end of the revolt played out across the landscape, a long trek across Westmoreland and St. Elizabeth and on into Clarendon, right? That passed very close to Accompong Town unimpeded, unhindered, right? Now, we don't know exactly the reason for that, but I think that one can guess plausibly that those Maroons in Accompong Town let the rebellion pass unmolested, right? So they had their own disagreements with Cudjo's Maroons in Trelawney Town. So I think, again, taking Black politics seriously, one can't assume that Black people are always going to be on the same side, right? You have to actually look and see what their interests are at the moment, what kinds of alliances are being made, and for what purposes in the historical moment that people find themselves.
Yeah. There's a comment from Audrey Allwood. It seems the war is still going on. How do you liken that time to now and last year's and now and the recent international marches against the ongoing crimes against Black people? Belonging is also a remaining issue continuously negotiated all over the world. So the question, I think, is really about making the connection between the past and the present. How, you know, the war for emancipation, for freedom is still going on.
So one of the things I think is important to recognize that may emerge from this story is that, you know, if one takes Olaudah Equiano seriously and sees slavery itself as a state of war, right, then what survives slavery, right, was not just economic inequality, right, not just assaults on people's personal dignity, not just racism that helped to determine people's status, but a kind of anti-Black militarism that didn't necessarily end with slavery. That Black people became people who were subject to greater amounts of violence in these post-slavery societies because there had been the habitual practice, right, of committing violence to keep Black people in their place in a number of societies. Now, it gets tricky because one finds that slavery, anywhere you find it, is an extraordinarily violent enterprise. It's maintained through the exercise of collective violence, right? That was the case in Jamaica, it was the case in the United States, it was the case in Brazil. Now, what happens is that means that, you know, Black lives are devalued, right? And this is a fundamental part of racism. And Black lives become the target of violence, even for other Black people. And that, I think, is one of the hardest things to consider. So that, you know, the police in the United States, right, disproportionately are violent towards Black and brown people. The police in Jamaica, most of whom are Black, are disproportionately violent toward Black and brown people. The police in Brazil, right, many of whom are Black and brown, are disproportionately violent to Black and brown people. So that legacy of slavery, that anti-Black militarism, I think is something we really have to contend with. And it's something that grows out of seeing slavery itself as a state of war.
We've now had a very good suggestion. This story, Takyi's story, Tatch's story, should be made into a movie, children's book, an inspiration and reminder for our continued liberation today. Multimedia. I guess the person is saying, yes, the history and the lectures are important, but we need now to create multimedia platforms to get the message out.
So I completely agree with that. I would love to see Takyi's Revolt made into a major international film, maybe with $100 million budget.
Absolutely.
Maybe, but if you can help me raise that $100 million budget, then we'll get there faster. But yes, I am not a historian who thinks that these stories can only live in books, can only live in journal articles, can only live in lectures. These stories have to live, as I said, in word of mouth among the people, right? They should be in graphic novels. They should be in paintings. They should be in songs, as they are in songs. They should be in poetry, as we learned earlier. I do this part, right? And I am very happy to collaborate with anybody who does these other parts. I would love to work with an artist to make this into a graphic novel. The cover art that some of you will recognize, some of the older of you will recognize, is from a 1962 comic called The Story of Jamaica that was published to coincide with Jamaica's independence. And the artist kind of drew a whole comic of Jamaican history from Christopher Columbus on through independence. And this image is the image of Chief Tatch's Revolt that he drew, and I used that for the cover. So I completely advocate for the telling of this story in other media.
One of our local publishers should republish that comic, because that's a way to get children's attention, and we need some video games of these years of war. I like Professor Beckles' notion of this one continuous war. There are episodes, and it's just a heroic war for emancipation. Somebody asked, if I remember correctly, you said that not all the rebels wanted to end the system of production. They wanted to control it. Does that mean that they were willing to maintain the system of slavery, or did they want to engage in production through other non-coercive means?
Yeah. So my assumption is that, if they had been victorious, again, the society would have changed fundamentally. Exactly how it would have changed, we don't quite know. If one thinks ahead to the Haitian Revolution, right? There were all kinds of different political programs on the agenda. There was, Toussaint Louverture, whose republicanism and the way he governed the early revolutionary Saint-Domingue was different than the way André Rigaud governed in the South, which is different than the way that Dessalines would have governed eventually an independent Haiti, right? With slavery abolished. One understood through the course of the Haitian Revolution that in some form, right, slavery was going to have to be abolished because that's what the mass of people wanted. And so even people who wanted to maintain some kind of coercive labor, as people who think a lot about the Haitian Revolution will know, Toussaint Louverture actually passed a kind of coercive labor requirement in his 1801 constitution, and even before, and yet he still outlawed slavery because that was an absolute demand of the people that he was trying to govern. So it's my assumption that the society would have changed. It probably would have been post-slavery, but it might not have been a republic. It certainly might not have been a democratic republic. And there would have been people advocating, there would have been elite Africans advocating for the maintenance of slavery, for the continuation of slavery in some form, perhaps as they knew it in Africa, which would have been quite different than the way they knew it under British rule. The question that immediately leads to is, would the masses of enslaved people have tolerated it? And that I doubt.
That's a very good point. If you want freedom, you're not going to take a bogus, watered down version of it. Now, there's an interesting question coming from Yvonne Bailey-Smith, who is surprised to hear about the lack of compulsory history teaching for high school children in Jamaica. Perhaps Prof. Shepherd, you could come in on this one, because to me, it's a tragedy that history is not a compulsory subject. Neither is literature, for that matter.
Thank you, Prof. Cooper. Yes, I think that a lot of people know that I've been batting on that wicket for quite some time. I have written to almost every Minister of Education. I haven't written to the current one, but I will. But I have approached so many Ministers of Education about the issue. I've mentioned it in all the spaces that in which I speak. I've been saying it on Talking History, because I went as far, I think, as to say it's a crime against our people, because it's a crime not to allow children to have a sense of themselves and their origin. And every day we talk about Marcus Garvey, but we're not really implementing what he said. We big up Mandela, and yet Mandela talks about you can't be proud of yourself if you don't know your history. So historians have been joining the battle. I agree about literature as well. There should be a basket of subjects that students should do in order to be a human being, in order to be a citizen. You need to know these things, and and I think when we look at what's happening in terms of the crime and everything, I think you have to have an interministerial joint up approach, because you have to look at the social justice agenda as well. It's not just a sort of military control. But it's not only Jamaica, right across the CARICOM region, it's not compulsory. So, and I'm sure Dr. Okenve has seen the result of that in the low numbers choosing to do history at university level. We have to get on this. We have to lobby. We have to appeal, because it is just not right. And it's not only a moral issue, it's just destroying our citizens in the sense that they don't understand the present. And if you do not understand the past, or you are introduced to what happened in the past, you can't understand the present. So we keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again. Sorry to be so long, Carly.
No, I completely agree. And you sort of wonder if it's not a deliberate strategy to say history is not important, because you don't want to stir up these bad memories and you don't want to make people rebellious. This is part of the problem, that we don't want to confront our past, because we might have to now recognize its legacy and to see who are the beneficiaries.
I wrote an article on that. I gave a lecture on that. It is called Too Dangerous.
Yes, absolutely. History is too dangerous. A very good question here now. Can Dr. Brown elaborate on the role of religion in the rebellion?
So we know for certain that it was Obeah and Obeah women who were the counselors, the spiritual counselors to the rebels. We have a lot of evidence about that. They were, one of the most important things they did was they administered loyalty oaths to help bind people into alliances, into collective units. Now, in fact, that's one of the ways that warfare worked in Africa as well, is that You had shamans, spiritual counselors, administering loyalty oaths to bind people into fellowship. You also had them conferring spiritual protection on fighters, right? The idea being that they wouldn't be as harmed by bullets, or that they would, that they would be more powerful in their campaigns. And the British, when they captured several Obeah, they thought that was the turning point in St. Mary in that part of the war. So we know they were instrumental to that. Now, I would also say that, when you look at the rules of warfare for the British, one of the first things they do is they read out a loyalty oath before they go into battle in the Articles of War, and it talks about their adherence to the State Church of England. So it's not as if it's only Black people or only Africans, right, who are kind of using these spiritual invocations to gird themselves for battle. The British are doing the same thing or something similar.
A question, what would you say is the next area of research that has not been adequately explored?
So I would go back to what I said about thinking about the continuity of these stories as they come down kind of among Black populations before the historians get to them. And I think this goes back to the question of compulsory history education. I absolutely agree with Prof. Shepard. I wish I had had more education about the history of slavery when I was in high school. And frankly, there was almost none. I actually was inspired to learn the history of slavery from musicians. So it was people like Bob Marley and Peter Tosh and Burning Spear and Steel Pulse, the English group, that were talking about Black history and the history of slavery in ways that inspired me to want to pursue the subject. So again, this doesn't have to come just from historians, it comes from the culture. And ways of connecting, we need to find more ways of connecting the historians with the culture so that people understand that this is their history. One other issue that I think we contend with, especially in this field, is that often people think that the history of slavery and the history of slave holders is Black history. And Black history is obviously connected to the history of slavery and the history of slaveholders, but it's something different. It's the history that we remember. It's the history that we tell. It's the story from our perspective. And I don't think that historians have been as good at encouraging people to understand that this is their history, right? Not the history of those white colonists and slaveholders from in the past. And we still have more work to do in order to inspire people to learn this history, as well as to compel them to learn it.
Another question from somebody based in the UK. What do you think about the recent government bill in England to clamp down on political protests, which came directly after the Black Lives Matter protest? If protest is prevented, what are some of the other effective avenues left for us to fight the continued war that we are in against the indignities of racism?
Well, I mean, I obviously think it's ridiculous. They would rather have propaganda than truth. We saw how that worked out in the Soviet Union and other states that kind of pursue these state campaigns against the truth. I mean, I think, the problem is that, when they no longer control access to knowledge, when it's we who are telling them about history, they don't want to hear it, right? We know what that's about, though. That's about control of information. That's not about the truth at all. So I think what we have to do is keep telling the truth, keep telling our stories, and insist upon them. And that's how we educate ourselves.
Well, talking about education, this is really a quite distressing comment from Devere Beton. Only the tip of the iceberg is touching history taught in school at the primary and high school level. The focus of some students is just studying to get a good grade, not to apply it to the modern society. So the question is, how do we get students to make a connection between what they are studying and their lived reality?
Yeah. I tend to think that any good history comes from an engagement with three sources. You have to think about those sources produced in the past. I mean, as a historian, I have to really think about those. I have to want to read the old material, to learn what happened, and to be very curious about what happened. I also want to engage in dialogue with other people who care. not only with my fellow historians, but also with those people who know the folklore, right? This is why I've enjoyed my conversations with Black X so much, is because he comes at this history from a different perspective. But I feel like we are accountable to each other in trying to tell this story. And that leads to the third thing, which is one can't be afraid of who we are, our perspective, and what kind of world we want to see. That is part of the way we tell the story. It's part of what compels us to seek the truth of history. It's part of what compels us to ask certain questions about why the world is the way it is, right? And so if one wants to understand the enduring inequalities that one sees in the present, the answer is to look to history, right? It's the history of slavery, the history of conquest and colonialism and racism that helps to explain these enduring inequalities in the present that we do care about. I mean, for the longest time, people were trying to tell us that we're poor because we wear our pants too low, right? And then they don't want us to explore the history of slavery and colonialism, which is actually the source of poverty for most Black people in the Americas. So I do think that we have to, think about why it is we want to know this history, what it is we're going to study, and then seriously engage what happened in the past without propaganda, without thinking that, there's only one story that can be of service. We have to want to discover the truth, but we have to know why we want to discover the truth, right?
That's an excellent note on which to bring the formal presentation to a close. Thank you so very much for Professor Brown for a wonderfully engaging lecture and for the way in which you have so graciously answered all the questions that have come to you. I know that Minister Grange is in the house. I'm wondering if she would like to make a few remarks. Minister Grange, if you would like to, and you're still with us. If not, I would invite Ms. Gabrielle Hemmings, who is a research assistant in the Center for Reparation Research, to do the vote of thanks. This is a lovely Jamaican tradition that you have to have. So, Ms. Hemmings, please thank us.
Thanks so much, Prof. Cooper. Thank you so much. As we close this evening's event, I must extend thanks to everyone who has made this evening a possibility. To you, our moderator, Prof. Cooper. A huge thanks for effortlessly seeing us through this evening's event. To Minister Olivia Grange, Minister of Culture, Gender, Entertainment, and Sport, and a stalwart in the reparatory justice movement who took the time out of her very busy schedule to join us. Thank you. Thanks must also be extended to our co-hosts, Professor Vereen Shepherd and Mr. Derek Robinson, Black X, for working in front of and behind the cameras to ensure the success of this event. To our participants, Honorable Dr. Norman Dunn, Honorable Dr. Maurice Guy, Ms. Kabuma Atkeru, and Dr. Enrique Okenve, thank you. To our keynote speaker, Professor Vincent Brown, words cannot express our gratitude to you for providing us with such an informative and thought-provoking lecture on the 1760 War, led by Chief Tatch. For the knowledge imparted today, thank you. As a token of our appreciation, we would like to extend to you a copy of Volume 68, 3, and 4 of the Journal Social and Economic Studies, the Special Reparations issue. An issue which provides such a wide and diverse perspective in relation to the reparatory justice movement. It is our hope that this will be a meaningful body of work for you. Of course, we will follow up with sending a physical copy to you. I must also extend thanks to our technical support team from the Center for Reparation Research, Mr. John Shorter, Ms. Dominique Dunqua, and Mr. Floyd Williams, whose technical and administrative support greatly aided in the success of this event. We, of course, have to also thank the UETV team, including Ms. Janet Carew and Mr. Jamani Dunn. And I know from our technical side here at the CRR, this would not have been a possibility without their guidance. Finally, thanks to you, our viewing audience, for fueling such an engaging and profound conversation, and sticking with us till the very end. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Over to you, Prof. Cooper.
And thank you, Ms. Hemmings, for thanking all of us. I must say, you know, it has been a wonderful evening. As Yvonne Bailey Smith says from London, an amazing lecture, powerful. We need more of these, but we need to get our young people to attend these lectures, how to get beyond preaching to the converted, as it were. Thank you to all the amazing speakers and the poet with a wonderful name, Kabumat Keru. Thanks to everybody for having made this a truly memorable Chief Takyi lecture. And as we go forward, let us do our best to make sure that we convert the talk into action, not just to make Tatch a national hero, but to make sure that the struggles of our ancestors are realized in the quality of the lives that we live now, because we have so-called freedom, and we need to make this freedom count, not just for ourselves as individuals, but for the society and for the generations to come. Thank you so very much. Have a good evening.